we think that if someone just makes the claim that we could be wrong, that we have to respond to that, but I don't. I only need to respond when someone can present evidence that I could be wrong. So, for example, someone might say, what if people made up Christianity or made up God, and you're just living according to something someone made up? What I would say is, that's a really great question. Do you have any evidence that that's actually the case?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. If you are doubting or deconstructing your faith, you are in the right place. On this podcast, we try to make space for Christians to be totally honest about their doubt, but still hopeful about faith in Christ. In this episode, I talked to my friend Jim. How do I know Jim? I just honestly met him online while doing work around faith and doubt. Jim is a pastor, he has been a teacher, and he's also experienced doubt himself. In this conversation, we talked about how to have the courage to address our doubts, how to have intellectual humility, and how to find people to journey with. Enjoy the conversation.
Live in St. Louis, Missouri, in America, and I'm pastor of a medium-sized Presbyterian church called Bonham Presbyterian. I think one thing I would want folks listening to know is that I was not raised in a Christian home. I wasn't raised in a place where faith was really emphasized, but I ended up coming to some degree of faith early on. I had a weird spiritual curiosity that then was sort of cultivated by two grandmothers who had a faith in Jesus, and then also an aunt who really took interest in the fact that I was interested in spiritual things. I landed in a university setting later on in life where my faith was significantly challenged. I got to a place where I was questioning whether I just needed to walk away from my faith altogether. And in that moment, I made a commitment that I would not shy away from any doubts whatsoever. That's been a lifelong commitment for me to not shy away from any of those.
I'm curious, what about like your time in university led to sparking all that doubt? Was there something like a specific instance that caused that?
Yeah, it was actually a number of incidents. Actually, kind of give you some backstory. I kind of came to faith in my aunt's church, and grew up trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian, through junior high and high school and all that. And, there was definitely a faith there, as immature as it was. And then I spent 1 year at a Christian college and very quickly realized this is a Christian bubble, like it's sort of an incubator of a bunch of Christians. And I wasn't crazy about my major at the time. And so I ended up transferring to Truman State University, which is in northern Missouri. And it's kind of known for being one of the more academic schools in Missouri, and certainly a secular university. In my first week on campus, I had a sociology professor begin 6 weeks of his own apologetic for atheism, trying to demonstrate that people invented belief in God to cope with the harsh realities of the world. That was sort of his thing that he was teaching us for 6 weeks. Then I went, that first week I went to my biology class where my professor talked about the fact of evolution and how science leaves no room for the possibility of God. And then at the time I was a psychology major, and I went into my psychology class, and the professor literally said the first day of class, you can leave if you're a Christian or whatever, you can leave your faith at the door because it has no business in the classroom. And so I just became totally disoriented, like, oh my gosh. And I remember I was sitting in that sociology professor's class, and I prayed the most nonsense prayer. This will tell you that I'm not the most brilliant person, but I prayed the most ridiculous prayer. I prayed, God, if you're not real, I need to know that, which, is ironic looking back at it. Here are these sort of representatives of knowledge, right? I mean, university professors telling me that there is no God. It really challenged me in a way that I'm like, well, I don't want to be, just some ignorant person who believes in God because I've made it up or because, it's just been handed to me. I don't want to be that person.
Yeah. I love that nonsense prayer. That's okay. I mean, I feel like when you're doubting and freaking out, like there's a lot of nonsense prayers that go
Sure.
on. So no judgment there. But yeah, so in the middle of that, where did the courage come from when faced with such opposition to go, I'm actually going to look at this? Because one strategy you could have had is to retreat back to the bubble. You could have ran to the bubble,
sure, yeah.
or you could have said, I'm done. Or you could have buried it, and just kind of like lived in that cognitive dissonance for a few years. Like, it sounds like you were actually willing to wade into it. And I'll say, like, when I encountered doubts, it did take me years before I was willing to pull the trigger and actually look at them seriously. So I don't know, maybe you have a story that led up to that, but what was it that made you want to actually be so honest about your doubts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never thought about that question, but that's really intriguing. I appreciate that you characterize it as courage. I don't know that I would have put it that way, but I like that a lot.
Well, I genuinely believe that it is courageous.
Sure.
It's adventurous in the truest sense of the word. Like you're going into the dragon's lair. It feels.
I think probably what is more the case had less to do with me and more to do with where God had placed me in that moment. So I was involved in a campus group that just did a really good job of being open to talking about these things. So pretty much as soon as these questions hit my heart, I went to the leader of this campus group and said, hey, this is what I'm facing and I don't know what to do with it. He was willing to engage with me on those, to really sit with me. His pace of ministry was such that he had time to actually talk through these things and listen. And so I feel like it was less my courage and more the willingness of this group to engage with me in my questions. They created an environment where I felt safe enough that I could ask those questions, and they were willing to do that hard work with me of processing through those. It was in the midst of that the head of that group ended up putting me in a book study with 3 or 4 other students, looking at Love God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland. And this was revolutionary for me because it was my first time ever reading a book of my own choosing. All other books before that were assigned to me. So if I didn't have to read a book, I was not reading a book.
Relatable.
I decided, I'm going to read this book because this was bothering me enough. So I'm in this book study. We're talking through it. And in Love God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland, I discovered a scholar who was able to make sense of some of these things. So there are a number of things kind of going on there. I think one is that I have this person who also represents knowledge saying what these professors are saying is not foregone conclusion. Like there's more to the story here. One of the things I think Moreland did in that book that really was helpful to me was to show me how these professors were really speaking outside the scope of their expertise. So while they are representatives of knowledge, they're speaking in the realm of theology and philosophy, and they haven't been trained in those areas. And so maybe they're not the best equipped to answer questions about who God is and how a faith in God comes to bear in academics. And that was a new concept to me that I hadn't thought about. I can learn certain things from these professors, but then there are certain other things that they may be saying that are not of their area. It's not to say they can't talk about those things as a human being. Certainly they can, but to posture as if, this is academic knowledge is not accurate.
I can really understand why that's so destabilizing. It almost feels like you borrowed courage from your peers. Like you felt really afraid, but you were able to approach other people who were followers of Jesus, and they were able to kind of lend some courage to you to say, okay, well, let's dig into this and let's read some books together and that kind of stuff. And it sounds like that was really formational for you.
Yeah, and I would say that's often how faith and courage work. Is that we do end up starting by borrowing from other people. And I would say that's certainly the case with me. I think what made J.P. Moreland's work more compelling as I started into that book and then as I continued on is I realized that the arguments were better. So it wasn't like one authority figure versus another authority figure. Like he was able to demonstrate why some of the things that were being said undermine their very claims. So, a simplistic version of that is you cannot have knowledge of God, right? Well, that itself is a knowledge claim about God and is by definition sort of undermines itself. That's a very simple way of thinking about it. But he sort of would demonstrate how some of the arguments that were being made actually undermines the very thing that they're trying to say. And I found that to be true, sort of intuitively true. As I looked at it, I'm like, oh, yeah, of course, it has to be that way. That continued to build that desire and that, as you've used it, courage to move forward.
Yeah, and I think you've made a really helpful distinction there in that there are always going to be people smarter than you who are going to disagree with each other. So
sure,
as much as we do believe things based on good testimony and authority sometimes, like there is some level at which you yourself have to be convinced that something is actually true. What I'm saying is the evidence actually does matter.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, learning kind of just about, self-refuting statements about God was helpful, but was there any other evidence that really helped you work through the doubts you had?
If I could pull a strand throughout my whole life of something I've held on to a lot, is just the idea of knowledge. Like, what does it mean to know something at all? And I think that's something that every human being has to account for, that most of us are not very good at knowing how we would account for that, which is interesting because we live in an information age, right? You can find out all kinds of random things with a few clicks. But understanding how knowledge works and how it is that we can say we know anything at all, that really began in that first reading and sort of led me all the way through, even when I did my doctorate degree, to really want to lean into the concept of, the fancy word for it is epistemology, but it's the study of knowledge to understand how knowledge works. And as I did that, I realized that no, we can actually know things about God and we can actually know things about religion. Faith and knowledge are not opposed to one another. They actually work together. Every human being has faith and every human being has knowledge. Most of us, when we talk about faith and knowledge, we think of faith as the absence of knowledge. In reality, faith tends to be where we place our trust or where we live out the things that we think we know. So like an example of that might be, when I go to my doctor, I at least think I know that he thinks that he knows what he's talking about. He actually learned medicine. So I'm coming under his authority, but I'm doing so because I've had to make a decision before I chose that doctor that he knows what he's doing. And I do that on all kinds of ways, which we could get into, but probably boring. So I am placing my faith in my doctor because I think he knows what he's talking about, right? And as I listened to J.P. Moreland, I was sort of more willing to come under his authority because he's demonstrating to me that there's substance behind what he's saying. And he's showing me how, without even knowing who these other professors are, how what they're saying doesn't hold weight.
You're making a statement that I'd love to follow up on, which is that when you kind of looked at the discipline of epistemology, the theory of how we know, that then you felt like you could actually come to some conclusions about what you know. So my question is, if there was a core doubt, what was that? Were you like doubting whether you could know God was real? And then this could be a really big question to unpack, but then how did you go through that epistemic journey of actually going, no, I can know this? Because I think doubters want to hear that. How did you actually come to that kind of conclusion to say, I know? Because that's hard to come to.
First of all, I want to acknowledge that I had already had a faith in Jesus prior to this whole conversation. And so I have come to appreciate the Holy Spirit's work of putting me in that community that would process these, and the Holy Spirit of, bringing about an opportunity for me to read books. So I want to sort of acknowledge sort of God's activity in the midst of this also. So it's not just like me following epistemology and,
Sure.
I didn't have eyes to see that at that time, but here I am, 25 years later or whatever it is. And I can see that now that, man, God really was doing a work there. As far as the epistemology piece, I think for the first time I started asking myself questions about, well, what does it mean to know anything at all? Because like I've got this professor telling me, well, you can't know God exists or God doesn't exist or whatever. And I'd never really critically thought through the issue of what it means to know anything at all. And this is where I think Moreland was really helpful for me. He essentially says there are three types of knowledge. There's knowledge by acquaintance. So I have a knowledge of an apple sitting on my desk through my experience of seeing something, knowing what it is, having past experience, those sorts of things. There's knowledge by skill or know-how. This is why we go to the doctor. This is why we go to the mechanic. There's a know-how, there's a skill. And, wisdom could be a skill of life. And then there's this other, which is knowledge by proposition. And the way that has historically been defined is a justified true belief. In other words, it's a belief, something that we have faith in, that we trust in, right? That is true. It aligns with reality. It turns out it actually is true. And we have good grounds for believing that it's true. So once I understood that's how, that sort of these are the ways that knowledge works, I began to say, okay, well, if that's the case, if I have good grounds for believing that Christianity is true, and if it is the case that Christianity is true, then I can actually say that I know it. I think it's at this point that the doubter, of which I've been many, many times, would say, well, you can't be certain. And I would say, well, really, when you get under the hood, like what really can you be certain of? It's sort of the nature of knowledge that we're never going to be certain. We're going to have to place our faith in what we think we know. For some, that can be very frustrating because it's like, well, I need to know with certainty. But for me, I found that actually very freeing because it gave me, it helped me understand how reality works, how knowledge works. And it helped me sort of have my path for how I figure these things out. So we do have a choice as to what we do with sort of this new reality that we can't have the certainty that we desire. I think for some, it leads to sort of that frustration and despair. And we've seen that project play out in philosophy, it goes from Descartes all the way down to Nietzsche, where you sort of just decide for yourself and, nothing ultimately matters. But then there's this other part of saying, okay, well, I can know some things. It doesn't mean I'm certain, but I can know some things. And I would argue that Christianity sort of fits into that category of things that I can know, that I have good grounds for believing that it's true, and it actually is true. And so it turns out that it plays that out. But if I'm looking for that certainty where I cannot be wrong, that's not the world that we live in. No human being lives in that world.
It is interesting that it's like, when you open up the idea of no one has certain perfect knowledge, there are these really distinct reactions that can come. One shuts down on pursuing knowledge and the other sees that as a catalyst. But I think for the doubter, sometimes, at least in my story, it's an anxious catalyst. It's like, whoa, I could be wrong. So I really got to dig into it.
Let me maybe tell a story that can kind of help you understand how I've lived into that.
Yeah.
For about 10 years, I taught philosophy at a community college and so forth. And from time to time, I would have, an atheist student or an agnostic student or whatever really challenge me on the idea that God exists. The way that I would approach that conversation is to say, you know what, you might be right. And so I need to hear more about what you have to say, because you may have discovered something that I haven't discovered. And I spend a lot of time and money on this deal, right? On this Christianity thing. And if I'm wrong about that, it would be really to my advantage to not spend my time and money on something that's untrue. So I need to hear you out. But I also sort of start with that person to say, at the same time, I need you to know that this isn't the first time I've thought about these things. I've thought about a lot of these questions. I've looked into a lot of these. And so I'd be surprised if you can present to me something that I haven't already heard, but I want to hear you out because you may know something. And the reason why I feel the need to set that expectation is that they don't get frustrated that when I sort of respond in the moment and say, well, but that doesn't work. Here's why, whatever. But over time, what I've learned, and this is something I try to teach my philosophy students, is that in order to learn anything at all, you have to approach whatever subject with what I call, it's not what I call, it's what people call epistemic humility, being open to the possibility that you could be wrong. So you're not saying you are wrong, and you're living out as if you know things, but you're open to the possibility that you could be wrong. This is a way of life that we don't often think about. You could be wrong when you drive down the street, come to that stoplight, you see that it's red, you could be wrong, and red could no longer mean stop. Joe Biden could have put out an executive order that says red now means go and green now means stop. And as of today, we're changing it. It's very unlikely, but I sort of operate under certain assumptions that that's true, and I'm probably right about it. However, if someone presents to me some evidence that I'm wrong, I need to consider that at the same time. So I live as if something is true, and if I have good grounds for believing that's true, then that is knowledge. However, if someone presents to me evidence that what I think is true is not the case, then I need to consider that. I think where it also gets uncomfortable is that we think that if someone just makes the claim that we could be wrong, that we have to respond to that, but I don't. I only need to respond when someone can present evidence that I could be wrong. So, for example, someone might say, well, what if people made up Christianity or made up God, and you're just living according to something someone made up? What I would say is, that's a really great question. Do you have any evidence that that's actually the case? And until you can present some evidence, I don't feel any need to waste my mental energy on that, because I have good grounds for thinking that it wasn't made up. If you can present some evidence, then I need to take that into consideration. That's living with epistemic humility,
In church world, if you were to actually say to people, yeah, like I am actually open to being wrong, I think people push back on that because it somehow feels less faithful than being like, no, I'm 100% sure. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does. It's not that I live as if I could be wrong. It's that I am open to it when I'm presented with evidence. So I would actually say, no, I live as if Christianity is true. And at the moment, I don't spend a lot of mental energy thinking about the fact that I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. I live my whole life right now because I truly believe and know Jesus really is who he said he was. Now, when I say no, the doubter hears me say I'm 100% certain. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
Now, in order for me to live well in this world, I would also say that if someone presents to me some piece of evidence that brings that into question, I have to deal with that in order to be honest. Otherwise, I'm no longer being honest about things.
That's helpful because you're right. The way that I phrased it could make it sound as though I was saying you just have to like sit in float land forever. Like you can never come down on something. And that's not really what I'm saying, nor is it how I like live my faith now. Like I do believe it. I do believe I'm a follower of Jesus.
You stop at the red light, right? Like
Yeah, exactly.
I like the way Dallas Willard talks about this. He says, a man who's lost in the woods has to move towards what he thinks will get him out of the woods. And even not to act is a decision in and of itself. And so I would say our way of being in this world is that if we're lost on these questions of God or knowledge or whatever it is, we're going to live as if something's the case. And to choose not to live as if something's the case in itself, a choice. There is no neutral position. You have to make a decision about whether you're going to stop at the red light or not. You have to make it. We can't, and on the God question, we can't live neutrally. We're either going to live as if a God exists or doesn't exist. Sort of another thing that I would add into this too is that beliefs are graded. I can more or less believe something and that change over time. So I have a very high confidence in my faith in Jesus today. If I were to put a percentage on it, I might even say like a 95% believe in Jesus. And I can talk about all kinds of reasons why that's the case. But like, it's also possible that, if one of my kids got cancer, that might poke a hole. That would impact that percentage of my faith. Now, how much, I don't know. And so I only say that to say is that our it's not just I believe it or I don't, I know it or I don't. That's sort of that can be a moving target based on all kinds of things, based on the community that we're in, based on the sense of closeness that we have with God, based on the evidence and whether we choose to take that evidence seriously, based on our real world experiences and how that lines up with what we think ought to be true about the world. So I want to acknowledge that I may have significant doubts tomorrow. I don't know. All I can say is this is where I'm at today.
Yeah. To the Christian who is not doubting, who might feel some anxiety over such honesty and might want to go like, okay, well, you can question some, but don't go too far. Don't lose your faith. Don't, you can question the doctrine of baptism, but you can't question the Trinity. Like some people might want to put little hedges of where you're allowed to go and where you're not. To that person who's afraid, do you think it's legitimate to say that when you read how Jesus approaches this idea of truth seeking, that Jesus says, seek and you'll find, like knock, the door will be opened. You don't have to be anxious because Jesus actually believes that if people are sincerely seeking the truth, they're going to find it. They're going to be okay.
Absolutely. I think that's right. I think we can trust God to do his work. I think we can trust that because we live in God's world, his truth will bear out if we're honest. I think there's certain things that are behind that impulse for the Christian who wants to build the hedges that are right, though. I would say it's the wrong response, but a right intuition. I think the doubter needs to be open to doubt their doubts, to not just assume Christianity isn't true because they have doubts, but to also inspect these doubts. Like for again, just to kind of go back to earlier, I think sometimes we think that just because something could be true or not true, that is somehow powerful. And I'm going, well, no, that's all fine and good, but I think we need some evidence behind that. Otherwise, it just becomes, you can go down mental roads all day long. So I think we need to doubt our doubts. I think that there is a biblical framework of remaining faithful in the midst of your doubts. I think we see that with Thomas. He had very clear questions that he wanted answered, and yet he remained faithful to this community of faith, even in the midst of that. So I think there's something right and good about remaining faithful, even in the midst of having doubts. I think at the heart of, the straw man, I guess, that you built there of, well, don't give up this or don't give up Christianity. Really what we're asking people to do is to live a dishonest faith. And that's a project that's really not going to be helpful. That's fine. You can't question certain things. Well, it's like, well, no, that's not a good way of being in the world. Like that seems really problematic for many reasons. Mm-hmm. I think the better is, hey, look, can I process through this with you? Can we talk through this together rather than, putting a staff only, or whatever sign up where people can't enter in.
You said you always want to be open and honest about questions, but you're also talking about, your confidence being very high that Christianity is true. So do you still kind of engage in that? Do those kinds of questions still pop up for you, or are they diminished? Have they diminished over time? Is it almost like diminishing like doubts over time? Like every time you get hit with a doubt, it's a little less impactful because your confidence is growing as you deal with doubt after doubt after doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those things could be true in some extent. So like I've done enough evidence work at this point that many of the controversial news stories that come out don't rock me in any kind of way. 9 times out of 10, I've already thought about that and already spent some time on that. So things tend to rock me less, certainly. Some things that I thought were big deals before are not big deals to me now. I don't think they're important. So to give you an example of that, when I first started in that college situation where I was being challenged in my faith, the concept of evolution versus a 6-day creation was a huge deal to me.
Right.
That is almost a non-issue to me now.
Mm-hmm.
I spend virtually no time thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because to me, the real question is not whether we have an old creation or whether we have a young creation. The question is, did God create it or not? And to
Right.
me, the evidence is overwhelmingly obvious.
Sure.
And so to me, the question of young earth, old earth is really, if we've already decided God created, it's an in-house debate
Hmm.
about what we think the Bible is saying and how we interpret it. So I don't get worked up over carbon dating and fossil records and stuff like that I find a lot of folks tend to spend a lot of their energy, as if they're thinking that's like the end all be all of the conversation. In some ways, I've learned better questions over time, and what questions really matter and what questions maybe don't matter quite as much.
Yeah, I know I resonate with that too. When I was in the middle of doubting, I had a really rigid view of scripture. And like when Jesus says, the mustard seed is the smallest of the seeds. And though it is not like literally the smallest seed that botanists know,
Right.
that messed with my categories. But Jesus is just going like, this is the smallest seed that we know, like that we interact with in our life.
Yeah, and who cares? At the end of
Yeah,
the day, the point's
it's
still
the
true.
smallest seed. Yeah, so I mean, I just bring that story to say that yeah, the things that can really really bother you years later seem almost silly. You don't want to mock your past self because I might still have questions that feel really big today that don't feel so big later. But I think that just shows that you do kind of progress in your ability to ask questions or ask the right questions.
And man, I don't want particularly those folks who are doubting to lose sight of this. Like part of it also is not purely intellectual. It's that I've had experiences of God that I cannot deny.
Hmm.
That like God has demonstrated himself very real to me. That is also part of this conversation that I can't lose sight of. Even if I wanted to, I can't. Like it's just so significant that like I have seen God show up, show his presence in my life in certain ways that like I can hold my doubts a little bit longer because I've had this experience.
Yeah, that's worth saying, especially because we've talked kind of about academics a lot this time, is that
Yes,
academics is not the only way of knowing things.
right.
Um, Experience and tradition and scripture. This is all part of epistemology when you dig into it, is that there's a lot of different ways to know things and a lot of different legitimate ways. So I want to just pivot just for a few minutes, if you still have time, because you did write a book called The Practical Art of Spiritual Conversation. And I understand that book isn't necessarily about doubters specifically, but as someone who tries to be really honest about doubt, but still hopeful about faith, I'm just kind of wondering, like, is there anything that you kind of presented in that book that you would think would be helpful in conversations with doubters? Like, are there approaches that you take to these conversations that you think could benefit a doubter listening to have like a certain kind of conversation?
Yeah, when I teach on the book, kind of the big thing that I share sort of on the front end is that what we always want to do in any conversation about spiritual things is spend the vast majority of our time listening and just a little bit of time responding. That we need to first seek to understand somebody as they are before we try to tell them what they ought to think, feel, or believe about anything. And I would argue that it's that understanding that leads to our ability to love somebody. I hope the way that people who are doubting are treated is that those of the Christian faith listening to them are not saying, you're wrong, here's the evidence. But they're taking the time to just really listen and be curious and understand what this person is actually thinking about and the questions they're asking, and really understand them on their own terms before we ever try to tell somebody, hey, this is what you need to think about this. And the conversations that I've had with folks who are doubting, it's me trying to take the posture of a sojourner right? Someone who's just journeying with them. It's not that I'm better. It's that I'm on this journey too. And so I'm sort of coming alongside and journeying with them. But I need to understand them and understand where they are in their journey before I can come alongside.
You said some truth snack buzzwords. Journeying with, like, it was like,
Yeah.
ding, 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 dopamine in my brain. I'm happy.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. It is a journey, and it's certainly not fixed with information download. At least that has not been my experience.
And I need to make sure that I understand that while I may be coming alongside you, oh person who's doubting now, there may come a time later when you're coming alongside me.
Right.
I do not want to posture myself as the expert who's giving you what you need so that you can be successful. I'm helping you today, but you might be helping me tomorrow. We're better as we work together.
It's like we're all praying, Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Like we're all there. We're all there, whether we feel confident or whether we're in crisis. Just kind of as we wrap up, I'm really curious, what advice then would you give to the doubter who's looking for that good sojourner? How would you suggest they find that kind of person that can really journey with them?
I think don't assume that the folks in your local church are not that. I think sometimes we develop sort of in our mind what church people are like and operate from that. But my experience of actual church people, particularly in this past year, as I've been a lead pastor in a church, is that we've got some really good people who could really journey with folks. And I think that sometimes we cut ourselves off from that possibility on the front end because we assume we're going to be judged, or we assume, X, Y, or Z, and say, don't make that assumption. I would also say follow your intuition. Like if you feel like somebody does not have the ability to work through a question or a doubt with you, you're probably right. If you're getting a sense this person's like going to judge me, or this person doesn't have the mental capacity to think about the question that I'm asking, like that's okay. You're probably right about that. But those people are there, and I think intuitively we all know what they're like. They're people who feel safe. They're people who don't shy away from hard questions or hard ideas. They're people who not only seem willing to talk to you, but kind of you feel like they want to talk to you. There's a certain posture of those people that you'll just sort of pick up on, being honest about where you are and seeing who engages further with that.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. Is there anything like left unsaid? Is there anything that you would have wanted to say that I just didn't give you the gap, the chance to say?
Yeah, there is actually one thing. One of the things that I noticed in my dissertation work, so I worked with primarily young adults in a church community. It was about 100 young adults. And one of the things that was surprising to me was when I started studying where they are in the confidence of their faith and that sort of thing, all of them started with an extremely high confidence that Christianity is true. And I didn't expect that. And when I began to ask more questions, there was no substance behind that confidence. Like there was no evidential reasoning. It's not that they had really thought about it. I realized that many folks in the church posture as if they're confident, even though they don't have substance behind that confidence. And that I found very troubling because it sort of undermines our ability to honestly ask some questions when we think that's what faith is. I'm just going to believe it. And I'm going to blah, 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 and I'm going to, if you've got real questions, like you need to be honest about those. There are some church people who sort of posture this confidence, but they don't have good reason for being confident. So I sort of want to find the people who really thought about, really taking the time to ask these questions and to wrestle with doubts. That's the more substantial faith, when we take the time to really wrestle with our doubts and ask these hard questions.
It's kind of like that, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that you tend to overestimate your confidence when you're ignorant because you don't know how much you don't know.
Right.
And then as you start to learn, you realize how much you don't know, and that kind of throws you into the pit of despair. But then what's interesting about the Dunning-Kruger effect is as you actually gain knowledge, then you actually
have like a grounded confidence, but what tends to be the case is you're a lot more humble about it because you realize how much is left to like still grow in. So that actually really brings together what you've just said a few minutes ago, which is like, you want to find those people who are gentle and patient and wise and are humble, because that doesn't mean they don't know. It actually means you might be finding those really valuable people who have actually done a lot of hard work, and they know how much work there is to do and how many hard questions there are. And that's why they're actually humble about it.
Yeah. I'm teaching on Proverbs right now. And one of the things I told my folks was the mark of the fool is thinking that they're wise. And the mark of the wise is thinking that they're not wise.
Yeah. Is that an actual proverb like that? Like, does it lay it out that clearly?
I mean, it's sort of systematizing what is being said through Proverbs, but yeah, I mean, that's essential. Like, the fool trusts in his own mind and takes joy in airing his own opinion, and doesn't counsel with others. There's all this stuff.
Right.
Whereas in order to enter into wisdom's house, you have to first assume that you're simple, that you need instruction.
Just makes me feel like, Lord have mercy. Like, we all need that mercy.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this episode was encouraging to you, would you consider passing it on to someone else you think it might encourage? And as always, if you have something to add, don't hesitate to reach out at matt@truthsnack.ca. Until next time.